Hello. Today, we'll talk about the fascinating story of a man named James Earl Ray, who became one of the most wanted criminals in the United States during the 1960s. This man put the FBI and all American security agencies on high alert as they hunted him down. Even after being captured, he managed to escape prison twice, despite being held in a high-security facility. How did he pull it off? What clever tricks did he use? And most importantly, what did he do to become one of the most dangerous criminals in America? James Earl Ray grew up in an environment closely tied to crime. He was the eldest of 9 siblings, and his father was a con artist and professional criminal who made a living through fraud and theft. The family constantly moved from city to city and state to state to evade the police. This was during the 1930s and 1940s, about 90 years ago. Growing up in such unstable conditions, James followed in his father's footsteps and found no other path in life but crime. James started his criminal career by committing small thefts as he moved between states. The first time he was arrested was in 1949 in California, after being involved in a minor theft. Because it was a petty crime, he was sentenced to less than a year in prison. However, he didn't learn his lesson, and less than 3 years later, in 1952, he was arrested again, this time in Illinois after attempting to rob a taxi driver at gunpoint. This landed him a 2-year prison sentence. During his second imprisonment, James made several attempts to escape, but all of them failed. He remained in prison until his sentence was complete. Upon his release, some might have expected him to turn over a new leaf, but that wasn't the case at all. Just a few months after his release, James was arrested for the 3rd time, this time in Missouri. His life of crime showed no signs of slowing down. James's story is filled with intriguing details and mysterious events. In the coming parts, we'll explore how he became one of the most wanted men in America and how he managed to escape from high-security prisons despite the odds. In 1955, James Earl Ray had barely gotten out of prison before he was arrested again. This time, the charge was attempting to steal checks through the mail. Since the U.S. Postal Service is a federal institution, this crime was taken very seriously, and James was sentenced to 4 years in prison. As usual, James attempted to escape from prison multiple times, but all his efforts failed. He served his entire sentence and was eventually released. However, did he turn his life around? Of course not. Just a few months after his release, James was arrested again in 1959. This time, the charge was an armed robbery. Surprisingly, the amount he stole was only $120, equivalent to about $1,000 today. Despite the small amount, James was sentenced to 20 years in prison due to his extensive criminal record and the dangerous nature of armed robberies, which posed a serious threat to public safety. James was sent to Missouri State Penitentiary in 1959, the state's largest and most secure maximum security prison. During his time there, he constantly thought about escaping. After spending 8 years in the facility, he finally devised the perfect escape plan in 1967. At the time, James worked in the prison bakery. This bakery didn't just produce bread for the prison but also sold large quantities outside. Every day, a truck would arrive to transport the bread for distribution. James saw this as his opportunity to escape. Over time, he used his position in the bakery to build strong relationships with other inmates, especially his colleagues. This was a calculated move, as he anticipated needing their help for his plan. His idea was to escape by hiding in the bread truck. After carefully analyzing every aspect of the plan, he shared it with his colleagues and asked for their assistance. Thanks to the goodwill he had built with them, they agreed to help him, even though they had nothing to gain personally. On April 23, 1967, James hid himself inside one of the bread delivery boxes. His colleagues helped him by covering the box with loaves of bread to ensure he remained out of sight. Of course, in order to execute this plan, they needed to distract the guards. One of James' colleagues, who seemed to have an injury in his leg, worked to draw the guards' attention. At that moment, James crawled into a cardboard box, and his colleagues covered him with bread to hide him quickly from the guards. James remained hidden in the box for several hours, having made small holes to breathe through. If he stayed inside without air, he would suffocate, but the space was cramped, and breathing was difficult. Despite this, he endured and held on. Eventually, the truck arrived, and they placed the box James was hiding in onto it. After the truck started moving, James jumped out quickly and ran to find the nearest place to hide. He found a junkyard and hid there until nightfall. Meanwhile, the police and security forces formed search teams, but they couldn't find him due to the large area they had to cover, and they only realized he had escaped after some time. After leaving the junkyard, James headed toward the forest, where hiding among the trees made it nearly impossible to find him. Even aerial searches with helicopters failed to spot him. James continued to move and change locations from city to city, evading the police. First, he went to Chicago, then left the US entirely and traveled to Canada. He stayed in Toronto for a while, then moved to Montreal. After several months in Canada, with the search in the US slowing down, he decided to return to the US, but this time he went to Alabama in the south. After a short time, he moved even further south to Mexico. There, he tried to engage in some strange activities, including attempting to become a director of adult films. He lived there for a while until March of the following year. In 1968, James returned to America and settled this time in the state of Georgia. This means that the man, who had escaped from prison, had traveled across North America in just 1 year. He was wanted at the time, but he wasn't a major target. He wasn't being pursued with full force or all available security resources, especially since the period lacked advanced technological developments like surveillance cameras or modern electronic systems that could have made tracking him easier. During this time, James bought a Remington rifle along with a scope that had a magnification of 7 times. He told the store owner that he intended to use it for hunting. Afterward, James moved to the city of Memphis in Tennessee, where he rented a room in a small hotel across from another hotel called the Lorraine. On the evening of April 4, 1968, James entered the bathroom of his room, opened the bathroom window, and fired a single shot from his rifle at a man standing on the balcony of the hotel across the street, killing him. The man he killed was Martin Luther King, one of the most important figures in modern American history. He was the leading advocate for black rights and a prominent social activist in the civil rights movement. You may have heard of Martin Luther King or seen his image somewhere. After the assassination, the police and the FBI quickly launched their investigations. The FBI initially declared James Earl Ray to be the primary suspect in the crime. After searching his room, they found a map with circles marking the locations of Martin Luther King's residence and the church he attended. They also discovered the Remington rifle used in the crime, along with the scope he had purchased. Initially, the scope on the rifle was changed, and all the evidence pointed to James Earl Ray's fingerprints. However, the reason behind his assassination of Martin Luther King was unclear. Nevertheless, the FBI announced James as one of the most wanted criminals in America and placed him at the top of their most wanted list, dedicating a large number of law enforcement officers to search for him. James had a long history of evading the police, as he was used to being pursued by them. However, this time felt different, and the manhunt was bigger than any previous one. Realizing this, he decided to leave America as quickly as possible. He headed north to Canada, where he managed to obtain a forged Canadian passport. Using this passport, he flew to London and then to Portugal. Based on some of his communications, it seemed that he was trying to find a job as a mercenary in Africa, but his attempts were unsuccessful. Eventually, he returned to London, specifically to Heathrow Airport, intending to travel to another African country using the forged passport. However, during his passage through passport control at the airport, they became suspicious of him. After an investigation, they uncovered his true identity, and he was arrested on June 8, 1968, 2 months after the assassination of King. He was handed over to the FBI, and his trial began. During the trial, James admitted to the crime, acknowledging that he was the one who killed Martin Luther King. But a few days later, he retracted his confession, claiming that he had confessed out of fear of the death penalty. His lawyer had advised him that if he didn't confess, he could be tried by a jury, which could lead to a death sentence. When James discovered that the death penalty laws had changed in Tennessee, he retracted his confession. When questioned about the evidence, such as his fingerprints on the rifle and in his room, James claimed that he had been involved with a secret organization behind the assassination of King and was unaware of it. He said the organization had used him as a scapegoat. Martin Luther King had many enemies due to his advocacy for civil rights, especially since, although slavery had ended, racial segregation still continued in the U.S. Blacks were still prohibited from entering the same restaurants, schools, or using the same bathrooms and public transportation as whites. King's fight for the rights of African Americans made him many enemies. There are also conspiracy theories suggesting that the U.S. government itself may have been involved in his assassination. James claimed that there was a person named Raoul who had made him by the rifle, and that Raoul had been in the room and fired the shots at King. However, his story contains some contradictions. There are many gaps in the theories surrounding the case, and it's possible that James was recruited by a certain organization or entity because there was no clear reason for him to carry out this assassination. The only logical reason is that someone pushed him to do it. However, it is clear that he was the one who carried out the act, regardless of his attempts to evade responsibility and claim his innocence. All the evidence pointed directly to him, while there was no evidence supporting his version or pointing to another person like Raoul. In the end, the charges were proven against him, and he was sentenced to 99 years, a life sentence, and transferred to Brushy Mountain Prison, which is a high-security prison and considered one of the toughest in Tennessee. This prison resembles a fortress and houses some of the most dangerous criminals, including murderers, serial killers, and rapists. If you enter this place, you must be extremely cautious, as any wrong move or even an inappropriate glance could put you in danger. The prison is located at the base of a mountain and is the final stop on the road leading to it, making it in a secluded area. Despite being small, it is one of the most dangerous prisons, where you could be at risk at any moment from the violent inmates inside. Since the prison is heavily guarded, escaping from it is extremely difficult. However, if you are serving a life sentence in a place like this, it is natural to constantly think about escaping. Especially when we talk about someone like James Earl Ray, who spent years moving from one prison to another, always trying to escape. As we saw, he succeeded last time when he escaped using a bread truck. If he managed to escape once, there's nothing stopping him from trying again, but this time, it will be much harder, especially with the strict security measures and the fact that the prison is surrounded by a 5-meter high wall with considerable thickness. The prison is surrounded by barbed wires at the top, through which a very strong electrical current flows. If a prisoner tries to escape and touches the wires, they will be electrocuted and fall to the ground immediately. The current won't kill them, but it will knock them down and might even cause them to lose consciousness. Even if, by some magic, the prisoner manages to bypass all these obstacles, there are 9 watchtowers surrounding the prison from every direction. The guards in these towers are heavily armed with all kinds of weapons, including guns, rifles, and grenades, and they are allowed to shoot any prisoner who tries to escape or climb over the prison walls. When James saw all these obstacles, he realized that the best way to escape was underground. He spent a long time looking for a weakness in his cell. The biggest weakness he found was a small ventilation opening, covered by a square metal cover fixed to the cement with screws. It wasn't difficult to remove the screws and lift the cover, but the opening was too small for an adult to fit through. It could only accommodate a child or a cat. James used a spoon to start digging around the opening to widen it, a very slow process because digging through cement with a spoon takes a lot of time. He had to hide his work from the guards, so he mixed toothpaste with a little dirt from the prison yard to create a paste that resembled cement, which he used to cover the holes every night after finishing his digging. Then he would place the metal cover back over the opening to make it look as if nothing had happened. Over the months he spent digging, James gradually lost weight, which made it easier for him to fit through the opening when it became large enough. Finally, after months of hard work, he managed to expand the opening enough to enter it. This opening was connected to pipes running beneath the prison, and these pipes carried various connections. At the end of the pipe corridor in the prison, there was a large exhaust fan whose job was to pull air from the cells and purify it. James was well aware of the path this corridor led to, and he knew that if he could bypass this fan, he could make it outside the prison. But the question was, why did he want to get outside? During the day, prisoners were allowed to go out to the yard. One day, James noticed an underground opening in the yard, resembling a sewer opening. He believed this opening led to pipes that supplied energy to the prison, with the power station located just outside the prison walls. If James could get to this opening, he might find pipes leading to the power station. This could be his way out. However, the problem was that he couldn't access this opening during the day due to constant surveillance by the guards. Therefore, his plan relied on bypassing the ventilation fan under the cells first, then going out to the yard, and from there, reaching the underground opening that would lead to the power station. The large fan had iron bars on it, and the only way James could pass through was if he cut the bars. He didn't have a saw or any tool to help him with that, so he spent a long time thinking about how to get the right tool. After months of searching for a solution, he finally decided to ask someone from outside for help, his brother Jerry, who was his closest sibling and often visited him in prison. Jerry Fadgem sent a private message to his brother asking for his help to smuggle a small hacksaw blade into the prison. The message was coded, and it didn't directly say he wanted a hacksaw, but instead, they used a secret cipher they had agreed upon. This way, even if the guards searched the messages before they were delivered, no one would be able to understand their true meaning. Jerry and his brother agreed on a clever method to smuggle the blade. Jerry cut the bottom layer of his shoe, placed the small hacksaw blade inside, and then resealed it. This way, the blade was hidden in the shoe in a way that was difficult to detect. Jerry then went to visit his brother in prison. Family visits were allowed in a special room, but they were under guard surveillance. Jerry was thoroughly searched before entering to ensure he wasn't smuggling anything. However, because of the way he had hidden the blade in his shoe, the guards couldn't find it. During the visit, James, Jerry's brother, was wearing exactly the same type of shoe, same brand, color, and size, because prisoners were allowed to receive shoes from their families. James had received the shoes from Jerry earlier, Over time, Jerry and his brother managed to swap their shoes under the guard's watch without him noticing. This allowed James to successfully smuggle the hacksaw blade into his cell. That very first night, James began using the hacksaw to cut through the fan bars. He knew the process would be slow and would require a lot of time and effort. James worked continuously for a long period, spending months almost every night working on cutting the bars. After 4 months of relentless effort, he finally managed to cut them and reach the fan. But the next problem he didn't anticipate was that the fan was made of very strong metal. He thought he could bend it with his hands and pass through easily, but the fan was much stronger than he expected. No matter how much he tried shaking it, hitting it, or pulling it, the fan wouldn't move. At this point, James realized that he would need another tool to help him bend the fan blades, something like a pipe wrench. Of course, it was impossible for James to smuggle such a tool from outside the prison, but fortunately, there was someone inside the prison who could provide it, a close acquaintance named Jake Morlock. Jake worked as a plumber in the prison, fixing pipes and similar tasks. Since prisoners were assigned various jobs in the prison, Jake, as a plumber, had access to certain tools, like the pipe wrench. Though these tools were under supervision, it wouldn't be too difficult for Jake to sneak one in for a single night. James came up with an escape plan and offered Jake to join him. Jake agreed, and his role would be to provide the pipe wrench to help bend the fan blades. However, there was another problem. How would Jake enter James's cell at night, since they weren't cellmates? Some cells were shared by 2 prisoners, but James's cell was individual. James noticed that there was a list containing the names of the prisoners and their cell numbers, written in pencil. The list was in pencil because sometimes guards would move prisoners around to different cells. This gave James an idea. He could change his name on the list to make Jake his cellmate. However, this move would be bold and dangerous, so he had to be very careful. James realized that the list was kept in a nearby office, which wasn't locked and could be accessed by any prisoner during the time when they were allowed out of their cells. They used to make sure to lock this room or office because they didn't consider it important. The guards were spread out all over the floor, so no one imagined that a prisoner would try to enter this office. James, of course, was smart and observed all the movements of the guards and any changes that occurred, so he chose the perfect day to carry out his plan. He decided to pick a day when the regular guards were on leave, and substitute guards would take their place. These substitute guards were fewer in number and lacked experience with the prisoners in this section. They weren't familiar with the prisoners' faces and names, so they had to rely entirely on the list. James waited for the anticipated day, which was May 2nd, 1971, the day when the regular guards were on leave. On this day, the substitute guards, who were fewer in number and inexperienced, arrived. James sneaked into the office room containing the list, wrote his friend Jake's name next to his own, and placed it in the same cell as his. Later, when the prisoners returned to their cells in the evening, the substitute guards began calling the names and assigning the prisoners to their cells based on the list. This is how James' plan succeeded, and his friend Jake was placed in his cell without the guards suspecting anything. By 2 a.m., after the guards had completed their final rounds for the night, James and his friend Jake left their cell. They had prepared fake heads, placed them on their pillows to make it seem as though they were asleep in their beds. This way, if a guard happened to pass by their cell, he would think they were sleeping. Then, they crawled through the ventilation shaft. Although Jake was overweight, he managed to squeeze through the opening with difficulty. They then descended into the pipe corridor, and using a special key, they managed to move the fan blades and create a passage for themselves. However, the opening was very narrow, and while James managed to squeeze through, It was impossible for Jake to do so because of his size. They tried to think of a solution, but it was clear that there was no quick fix, so Jake had to return to the cell, and the escape plan for him was cancelled. As for James, he decided to continue on his own. He was able to get out of the pipe corridor and reach the outer yard of the prison, just as he had expected. His goal was to reach an underground opening, similar to a sewage opening, which he believed would lead to the power station outside the prison walls. James was cautious to avoid being seen by the guards on the watchtowers. When he reached the vent, he immediately tried to lift the cover, but was shocked by something he hadn't expected. As soon as he lifted the cover, a blast of incredibly hot steam hit his face, coming out of the vent. He quickly closed the cover again. He now realized that the vent and the pipes inside carried steam to provide heat for the prison. If he entered the vent, it would be like throwing himself into hell, because the steam was unbearable. The problem was that he had no time to think. The place where he was standing was completely exposed, and at any moment, one of the guards on the watchtowers could spot him. He had to make a quick decision. Should he return to his cell and forget the idea of escaping, or take the risk? When he thought about everything he had gone through and the effort he had put into getting to this point, he knew he would hate himself if he didn't at least try. So, he decided to go down into the vent. Once he descended, he found that the place was filled with steam, and the heat was unbearable. The pipes that carried the steam and energy to the prison were old, and the thermal insulation around them was completely deteriorated. There was nothing to stop the intense heat that filled the room. James immediately felt the full extent of the mistake he had made. The steam was burning his skin, and he quickly realized he had to get out of there. He quickly climbed back up the ladder to the vent and exited the area. Unfortunately for him, the guards had noticed the amount of steam coming out of the vent. As soon as James had appeared, they saw him, and they immediately descended to arrest him. He was taken to a special room for interrogation, where his entire escape plan was revealed, along with the involvement of his friend Jake and the vent that he had dug in his cell. Meanwhile, James' brother, Jerry, was waiting for him outside the prison, parked in a car at a location they had previously agreed upon. He had come prepared to help with the escape, bringing a gun and money. Jerry waited for his brother until dawn, but then began to realize that the operation had most likely failed. He decided to return home. Soon after, he heard on the radio about the escape attempt by James, who had been caught. The escape plan that James had worked on for nearly 2 years was completely destroyed and foiled. After this attempt, James was placed in solitary confinement for 2 months as a disciplinary measure. He was not allowed to leave his small, isolated cell at all. And when he was finally released from solitary, you might expect him to have reformed, but James was thinking about escaping again and was trying to find a new way out. Since he was sentenced to life in prison, escape seemed like the only logical solution. But the situation had become increasingly difficult over time, with all eyes on him. He continued to think, search for opportunities, and look for any chance to escape. As the years passed, his determination grew stronger. In 1976, 5 years after his first attempt to escape, James was working in the prison laundry. There were workers doing maintenance in the laundry, and during their work, they replaced some metal pipes. James noticed that the workers had left the old pipes lying on the ground, and no one bothered to remove them, so he took advantage of the opportunity and collected them. Each pipe was about 1 meter long. He hid them behind the washing machines, in a spot where no one would notice. At that moment, he didn't have a clear plan for using the pipes, but he felt that they might be useful in the future, so he decided to keep them. As time passed, in 1977, 6 years after his last escape attempt, James was still searching for an opportunity. One day, while walking in the prison yard, he noticed something that caught his attention. The prison wall was topped with barbed wire and electricity, but James spotted a small area in the wall where it met the side of the mountain beneath the prison. In this spot, the electric wires were slightly raised above the wall, leaving a small gap through which a person could pass without getting electrocuted. Additionally, since the wall met the ground in that spot, it was an elevated area, meaning that if James managed to climb the wall, he could easily jump to the other side without harming himself. At that moment, James began to visualize the entire plan. The metal pipes he had hidden in the laundry could be used to make a ladder to climb the wall. The idea was clear and logical, but the problem was that the pipes he had were not enough to make a ladder tall enough for the 5-meter-high wall. Therefore, he needed to find a way to get more pipes. James contacted one of his fellow prisoners, named Duck Shelton, who was a former escapee with prior escape attempts from several prisons. When James presented the escape idea to him, Duck immediately welcomed it and thought it was a simple, clear, and feasible plan. James specifically reached out to Dag because he worked in the prison workshop, where they did bodywork on metal pipes. These pipes were considered materials, not tools, so they weren't as strictly monitored as tools like hammers or screwdrivers, which the guards counted daily. Dag would smuggle out small pipes each day in subtle ways, either hiding them in his clothes or throwing them out the window, until he collected enough pipes to build the ladder. Then, another member named Earl Hill joined the team, making the group 3 members: James, Dag, and Earl. Some might wonder why James' old partner, Jake Morlack, who had been involved in the first escape attempt, wasn't included in the second one. The reason is that the guards separated them and placed them in different cells, so they only saw each other rarely. The planning for the second phase, the actual escape, required complete secrecy. They realized they couldn't build the ladder and suddenly run with it in the open, under the guards' watch. The plan was to assemble the ladder at the moment of the escape itself. They decided to hide the metal pipes next to the wall in a spot near the location where they would break out. This area was where the prison wall met the mountain, and there was a small trench around the wall designed to drain water. They hid the pipes in this trench under fallen leaves, as it was almost impossible for the guards to spot them. The location was low to the ground, and to see the pipes, a person would need to be directly above the spot, making it an ideal hiding place. James and his friends were planning an escape, so they were looking for a place to hide the pipes until the moment of the escape. At the same time, they started studying the guards' routines. The number of guards in the prison was low compared to the number of prisoners, with 1 guard for every 50 prisoners. Although the guards were armed, and there were watchtowers and electric fences around the prison suffered from a lack of budget, making it vulnerable in certain aspects. This shortage of guards was a weakness that James and his friends could exploit. Studying the guards' routines was essential, so they began to observe their movements, especially the guard on tower number 4, Floyd Hooks, who was closest to the area where they planned to escape. They noticed that Floyd would come every day with a newspaper, reading it with full attention, never lifting his head to look at the yard or the prisoners. He would read the newspaper from the first page to the last without noticing anything around him. James continued monitoring him for months and realized that this was a weakness they could take advantage of. He needed his brother Jerry's help, who was always ready to assist. James asked Jerry for a large sum of money, as prisoners could use money inside the prison to buy necessities from the prison shops. They could also pay for services like laundry or even buy televisions and books, as long as they paid for them. There were also small wages paid to prisoners for tasks they performed inside the prison. Since the prison didn't allow large amounts of money to be given at once, Jerry gave James the money in small installments over several months. James also asked his brother to bring him an escape bag and wrote him a coded message that only Jerry could understand. Jerry took a bag and packed useful items for himself after escaping from prison. He put in the bag hair dye, a raincoat to keep warm, canned food that wouldn't spoil, some medicines, bandages, and also a gun with bullets. He thought these things would help him and his brother after they escaped from prison. He then buried the bag in a cemetery near the prison, which was the location that James and his friends had agreed upon after collecting enough metal pipes. After planning everything, they set the escape date for Friday, June 10, 1977. On that day, after the prisoners were taken to the outdoor yard in the afternoon, James and his friends began executing their plan. The metal pipes they had collected were waiting for them in the trench next to the spot where they were going to escape from the wall. They needed to connect the pipes together to make a ladder, but before that, they had to distract the guards. This is where the bribe James received from his brother came in. James paid a number of prisoners to create a diversion by fighting each other. The fighting caused a lot of chaos, drawing the attention of the guards, especially since there were fewer guards than prisoners. When James felt everything was ready, he took a final look at the guard Floyd Hawks, who was standing in watchtower number 4, the closest tower to the spot where they were planning to escape. Floyd was, as usual, reading his newspaper and even napping. James realized that this was the perfect opportunity, so he signaled to the prisoners to start the fight. The yard immediately turned into chaos, with everyone fighting each other. The guards in the yard were only 3 or 4, and their attention was entirely focused on trying to break up the fight. Floyd Hawks was still sound asleep and didn't notice anything. James and his friends quickly went to their positions and began to assemble the metal pipes. They had practiced how to connect them, so it only took them about a minute or less. They had designed the pipes with a hook so that when the ladder was placed against the wall, it would stay secure. When James reached the wall, he began to lift the metal ladder and tried to attach the hook to the top of the wall. While adjusting the ladder, he didn't realize he had raised it too high and touched the overhead electric wire. The electric current instantly transferred from the wire to the ladder, shocking James and throwing him to the ground. James managed to regain his composure after a powerful shock that threw him to the ground, sending him flying 3 meters. The shock was so intense that his friends in the prison thought he might be dead, but James slowly regained his senses. During those moments, his friend A.R. Hill cautiously brought the ladder, secured the hook on the wall, and made sure the ladder was stable. Once James regained his bearings, he stood up quickly and was the first to climb the ladder to ensure everyone's safety and make sure they could cross easily. His friends followed right after. The other side of the prison was elevated, so they didn't have to jump from a height of 5 meters, which made the escape much safer. After they escaped, several other prisoners in the yard noticed the ladder and quickly seized the opportunity to flee as well. Within moments, 3 more prisoners were able to escape using the ladder, bringing the total to 6. The last to escape was named David Powell, who worked in the prison kitchen and was wearing a white chef's uniform. When he saw the ladder and his friends escaping, he immediately ran to join them. However, his white uniform caught the attention of one of the tower guards, not Floyd Hawks, who was still fast asleep, but guard number 3, who was farther away but noticed what was happening. When the guard saw David running, he quickly aimed his rifle and fired at the prisoner who was trying to climb the ladder. The guard hit the prisoner, Jerry Wards, but did not kill him. Jerry fell to the ground along with the ladder, causing the other prisoners who were about to climb to retreat. Despite this, chaos continued in the yard as the prisoners yelled from above the wall. At that moment, Floyd Hawks, who had been sleeping, finally woke up to the sound of gunfire. He was startled and, in his confusion, fell to the ground while trying to grab his rifle. But by that point, it didn't matter because the 6 prisoners had already escaped. In the end, Floyd Hawks would be blamed for his negligence, even though there were many other issues in the prison that contributed to the chaos. He would become the scapegoat, as the prison director and the other guards would place the blame on him. After the escape, alarm sirens went off in the prison, and authorities quickly responded. The reports were sent to the governor's office and the security authorities, but the problem was that the prison was located in a remote area, almost like a small town with only about 500 people. This made the security centers, including the state police and local police, a bit far from the prison, resulting in a slower response. In such cases, every minute counts, as it allows the prisoners to get further away, making the search for them more and more difficult. However, despite the delayed response, the authorities' action was far from insignificant. The local police, along with the state police, border patrol, and hundreds of officers from various security agencies, were involved, including the FBI. The escaped prisoners were not ordinary criminals, especially James, who was one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. Media outlets also flocked to cover the story, with dozens of news agencies racing to the scene. The search operation was huge, conducted on the ground and in the air, using every possible means. The mountainous area behind the prison was filled with forests, making the search incredibly difficult. However, this also made it harder for the prisoners to escape, as traveling through the dense forest was extremely challenging. As soon as they escaped, James and his friends headed toward the mountains, and then they scattered, each going in a different direction. James was trying to reach Route 116, which would take him to the cemetery where his brother had buried the supplies bag. But as darkness fell, visibility became harder, and since their escape had been chaotic, James had no clear direction. The adrenaline was driving him uncontrollably, and by the time he regained his senses, he had no idea where he was. He tried to figure out the way and his location, but it was harder than he had imagined, as the forest was thick and trees blocked his view. After hours of searching, he lost hope of finding the road or the cemetery where his brother had left the supplies. Some might ask why he didn't wait for his brother outside the prison, like in the first escape attempt. The simple answer is that the first escape attempt had taken place in the middle of the night, so it wouldn't be discovered until hours later. But this time, the escape happened in broad daylight, making it visible to the guards, and the chase began immediately. Therefore, it was impossible for his brother to assist him or be with him directly. In the end, James found himself alone in the forest, surrounded by the unknown. James escaped into the forest with no clear path, exhausted after 48 hours without food, water, or sleep. While police were searching with dogs, they eventually tracked him down after 51 hours. The dogs led them to a pile of leaves where James had been hiding. When the police surrounded him, he surrendered without resistance. James was arrested and returned to Berkey Mountain Prison, where he later learned he had taken the wrong path during his escape. Had he gone the other way, he could have reached the main road and escaped. His capture made headlines, and his sentence was increased by 1 year, making it 100 years instead of 99. Despite this, James would attempt to escape again in the future.